Welcome to Masters of Regeneration Radio. Conversations with humans who dare to reimagine our place on planet Earth. Earth is changing fast. Evolution happening in real time. An intimate, circular understanding of nature and living systems. We are the land. The land is us.
The history of life on Earth has been a history of interaction between living things and their surroundings. Only within a moment of time, represented by the present century, has one species, humans, acquired significant power to alter the nature of their world. Having put ourselves in charge of our own evolution and that of other species, what will we choose to do with this extraordinary power? What are the benefits of nature that we take for granted? What can we do to protect biodiversity, and why does it matter more than ever now that Earth is changing so fast? These are some of the questions we ask ourselves in this episode 13 of Masters of Regeneration Radio. Here we go. 3, 2, 1. Hey everyone, welcome to episode 13 of Masters of Regeneration Radio. Our guest today is Patrick Venail. He's a 39-year-old French-Colombian community ecologist. He got his master's degree in Biodiversity, Evolution and Environment at the Université de Montpellier in France in 2006, and his PhD on Ecology and Evolution from the same institution in 2010. In 2011, the French Society of Ecology awarded him as the best young ecology researcher after his publication in Nature. From 2010 to 2013, he worked as a postdoc fellow in Bogotá, Colombia, and later at the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at the University of Michigan in the United States, where he started using phytoplankton as an experimental model system. Since April 2013, he's a senior research and teaching assistant at the University of Geneva, Switzerland, in the Microbial Ecology group. His research focuses on understanding biodiversity, that is, the diversity of life. His interests are at the interface between microbiology, ecology, and evolution. Working with microorganisms, that's bacteria and microscopic algae, allows him to explore both ecological and evolutionary processes simultaneously. He has mostly worked under controlled lab conditions, but has recently been involved in several fieldwork studies in Russia and Ecuador. He's currently focused in lake systems and the benefits they provide to humans, and into understanding the link between phytoplankton diversity and water quality. He has contributed to over 20 major scientific publications so far. Hey Patrick, welcome to Masters of Regeneration Radio.
Hello Thomas, how are you? Thank you for the invitation. I'm really glad to be here, to be able to share my thoughts and my ideas on my research, on my teaching duties too. Here at the University of Geneva. It's a pleasure for me. And I would like to start by maybe defining or explaining a little bit some of the words that you use in the introduction. For instance, ecology, for those who don't know what ecology is about. So ecology is about understanding and exploring how living forms interact to each other. For instance, imagine how one predator influences one species of prey, how they fluctuate together over time, how the populations will fluctuate over time together, and so on. But at the same time, ecology is about understanding how the environment influences species and living forms. So it's not only about species interacting to each other, it's also about how the environment influences species, but at the same time, species influence the environment. So it's a two-way causality relationship between the environment and the living forms. In the other hand, we have evolution. This is the other part of my research. Evolution is about understanding the appearance and how life changes over time. So we're talking about millions of years or many thousands of generations when you talk about evolution. We humans are the product of evolution over many hundreds of thousands of years. So that's what I do. I explore both approaches. I do ecology and I do evolution at the same time. And as you clearly explained before, I use microorganisms for that. And why organisms of such a small size? Because you can grow them easily in laboratory conditions. You have many generations in a very short time lapse. So that's what allows you to work at both ecological and evolutionary timescales. And another word that you used and that I would like to explain is biodiversity. So as you said, biodiversity is the diversity of life. But it's not only about, for instance, how many species you have, how many of them you can count in a country, or how many of them you can count in one particular system. It's also, and most importantly, about all the genes that you have in those living forms. This variety of genomes, this variety of genes that will contribute to how the species will fit into a particular ecosystem. It's also about the diversity of forms that you can have in a system. Imagine the different types of beaks that birds have. So those represent a variety of forms, how those birds will exploit the available resources. So biodiversity is a diversity of forms of life, from species to genes to traits. This is how we call that, those functions that allow species to cope with the environment.
That's very interesting. Are they related? Is form a reflection of genetic diversity inside a species? Inside an animal?
Yes, definitely. What you see, those forms, those traits that you can see, you call it a phenotype. So this is the color of the skin of a person. This is the color of the eyes of a person. That's the color of the feathers of a bird. That's the size of an insect. So all those traits are determined by the genetic composition of that organism. Of course, there's another component, which is the environment. The size of an animal will be also determined by the environment where it grows. The more prey you can get, the bigger you will be, of course. So the environment also influences, but a big part of those forms that you see are determined by the genotype, by the genes that are inside the living form. And that's why they are related, yes.
So you started off as a biologist, and then what drove you to be interested in evolution?
Well, I was born and I grew up in Colombia, one of the most biodiverse countries in the world. So I grew up by looking by my window and seeing different forms of insects, different forms of birds, different forms of mammals everywhere. So just 1 hour from my home, I could see a large variety of ecosystems. And as a biologist, I started looking at this diversity and getting interested in understanding why there are so many species out there. Why there's not just one species that dominates all the others. Why you have so many species of trees, for instance, in just 1 hectare of the tropical rainforest in South America. And if you want to understand those things that you see today, so those patterns that you see today, why there are so many species, you have to look back at the history of those life forms. And when you look at the history of the life forms, you look at the evolution of those life forms. Where do they come from? And how they originated at the beginning. You have to remember that all the living forms that you see today outside in the world come from just one ancestor, the same unique ancestor. So we humans, dogs, trees, mushrooms, bacteria, we all come from the same ancestor. And from there, it started to evolve, to diversify, to create new forms, to be able to colonize different environments.
Why do you think life does that? What is the purpose?
So evolution doesn't have a purpose. It's just like that. So from the very beginning, life was struggling to survive, to be able to persist, to be able to continue to regenerate and to produce a new generation of living forms. And evolution happens because of natural selection. This is what we learned from Darwin and Wallace over 150 years ago. So he provided a mechanism for understanding why evolution is apparently so perfect. How can it be that all the living forms that we see today are so perfectly fitted into their environment? And this is not because evolution has a purpose. Evolution doesn't want to do something perfect. It's just the result of selection forces acting on those forms. You need diversity to be able to evolve. If you don't have diversity, the species, the populations, the living forms will not be adapted to the environment. You need a variety, you need diversification, so selection can act on those, give advantage to one of those forms compared to the other. And this is how evolution works. So it's a misconception to think that diversity has a purpose. Let me give you an example. Humans have been selecting species for a purpose. So this is what we call artificial selection. So we have been doing this for many centuries. This is what we did with dogs, for instance. Someday, a guy decided that this wolf was a calm variant of a wolf, and he said, this guy can help me, maybe taking care of my sheep, something like this. And he said, I'm going to take this wolf, I'm going to domesticate it, and it became a dog after many generations. And this is natural. This is not natural selection. This is artificial selection made by humans because there is a purpose. And we did the same with many species of plants. This is why we can eat corn today. This is why we have coffee today. So all those plants were in the wild originally. And at some point, one particular person, one human said, this is going to be useful for me. I'm going to select those variants that will be able to produce more corn or that will be able to produce more coffee. And in that case, you can say that evolution happened to have a purpose because it was selected by humans. That's the difference between natural selection and artificial selection.
You could argue that the purpose is to survive. I mean, maybe it doesn't have I don't know if you could say that life has an overall consciousness saying that, we need to survive. So let's create as much biodiversity as we can so that we are resilient. But that it's a survival thing, creating a lot of diversity. And so for most of the history of life on Earth, it was the environment that was shaping organisms?
Yes, and for many years, for many centuries, I would say, ecologists or people working with ecology thought that species or living forms were the result of the environment, that the environment was shaping the species. But at some point, some other guy said, maybe it's also the way back. Maybe it's also species changing the environment. And today, what we think is the best solution is to consider that this happens both ways. The environment changes the species or the living forms, and the way back. Species change the environment. And again, another example that I can have from the top of my head to illustrate this is humans. In ecology, we have a concept that we call engineering species. And this is a species that has a high impact in the environment. So imagine a beaver. A beaver can cut trees to build a dam in a river that's going to have a huge impact in the full environment. It will modify the river, so many different birds, many fish, amphibians can live in that ecosystem because of the action of the beaver. And this is an engineering species. We humans are engineering species. We modify the environment very drastically for the best and for the worst. We can, for instance, build dams to protect entire countries for flooding. This happens in the Netherlands, for instance. We can also grow plants in the middle of the desert. We do that in Israel, for instance. And for the worst, we can also destroy ecosystems. And our impact as an engineering species is good and bad. And for some people, we are entering a new era in the history of Earth that some people call the Anthropocene. And this is because the impact of humans in the environment is so strong that it can be compared to the impact that had a meteorite many thousands of years ago, or a lot of volcanic activities. So the impact of humans that humans have over the last few centuries can be compared to those geological events, and we are entering presumably an era that we call Anthropocene.
Which means the age of man or humans. Yes. So we were sort of in this cycle, this loop, this two-way system that you were talking about between the environment and species, and we were in it in a way, but we have acquired this insane amount of power over the environment, and our influence on the environment, like you just said, is comparable to that of meteorites or high volcanic activity creating a lot more CO2 in the atmosphere and so on. Just last week, the UN released a very important paper, a very important report. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So last week, the United Nations released a special report on climate change. So this is a new report that's been edited and written over the last few months, and it's about how human activities will increase the average temperature in the planet for the next few decades. And the purpose of this special report was to compare how would be the impacts of an increase in 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to 2 degrees Celsius. Because we know the planet is getting warmer. That's evident. And the question about on this report is about comparing 1.5 versus 2 degrees Celsius. And what this report says is that there's a big difference between those two scenarios. So, of course, these are predictions that are based on modelization, on a lot of assumptions about how the planet will be warming over the next few decades. So it's, I would say, theoretical. We need to wait and see if this is true. But all the models converge into saying that this is going to happen. The difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees can represent a few centimeters of sea level increase. Of course, the warmer it will get, the more the North and the South Pole will melt. This means an increase in the sea level. By increasing the sea level, you will put more people at risk of flooding. Imagine regions in the world like the Netherlands that I mentioned before. Imagine Florida in the US. Those regions are basically at the sea level or even below the sea level. A very short increase, just a few centimeters, can make a difference in those places in the world. So you can lose a lot of land. That means less space for people to live in, less space for planting corn or cotton. So that's going to bring a lot of issues related to the capacity of our planet to provide enough food for people. Increasing by 2 instead of 1.5 degrees Celsius also means a decrease in the capacity to predict the weather. That means more storms that will happen suddenly. That means a decrease in the capacity to predict when it's going to rain. So basically, people will not know if their crops will receive enough water for growing or if they have to add some extra water to irrigate. Increasing by 0.5 degrees also means a spread of diseases. So you can imagine that some parasites or some bacteria that are not supposed to be in a place will be able to reach that place because it's getting warmer for them. So the conditions that they require to survive will be present in so many places that there were not before. So that's some of the examples of the things that can happen by just increasing an extra 0.5 degree Celsius in the average temperature in the planet.
I'd like to illustrate for the listeners sort of like the ways we have impacted the environment in the last 100 years or 150 years. We've, at an unprecedented rate in history, in those 100 to 150 years, created a lot of unnatural chemicals and so on. You actually recommended this ecology classic called Silent Spring, where Rachel Carson talks a lot about the use of pesticides and all that in the 40s and 50s. And could we go a little bit into that and then into what that means for what you just explained, the last report from the UN, and what else is happening in ecosystems?
Yeah, sure. So Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, was one of the books that I first read when I was a biology student in Colombia. And to be honest, this is one of the books that motivated me to become more into to be more involved into ecology and less into proper biology, I would say. This is what one of the books that awake me about the impact of humans in the environment. So, for instance, she talks about DDT and how the use of this substance can have a negative impact, not only in the target species, but also in the entire ecosystem. These kind of substances just can accumulate in the ecosystem, and it's supposed to be a way to fight against just one species, but in the end, it's going to have negative influence to the different trophic levels of the ecosystem up to the birds. And this is what she explains in her book, that human actions can have a much bigger impact than you expect at the beginning, because you don't know what's going to happen exactly in the environment when you just modify one little thing in the ecosystem.
Could you explain what trophic levels are?
Yeah, sure. So trophic levels is the different, as the word says, the levels that you have on the way species feed on each other in an ecosystem. So that's the way how one species eats another species. Imagine you have a lake. This is my favorite ecosystem right now. In a lake, you have different levels of the way the matter and the energy circulates. Everything starts with the algae, the phytoplankton. This is what we call the phytoplankton. Those microorganisms that can use the sunlight as a source of energy, and they will transform this into biomass. So they will grow by using the energy of the sun and some extra nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus that is present in the water. So those algae will use those resources to turn it into biomass. And then other species will benefit from that biomass that is available for them. They are not capable of using the sunlight, but instead they will going to use the energy, the matter that is stored in other organisms. So this is where zooplankton is going to come into this equation of the trophic levels. So zooplankton will feed on the phytoplankton. And then you have fish, which is another trophic level. Fish will feed on the zooplankton. And this is like different steps on how the matter and the energy circulates over the ecosystem. All gets in through the zooplankton and then moves in the different like levels of the trophic system. And then finally, for instance, humans can use fish as a source of matter and energy. And then we, by decomposers, so again, the bacteria and other organisms will decompose this living matter and return it back as inorganic matter into the ecosystem. So it can be again used by the same phytoplankton as before, and the loop is completed. So matter can circulate, energy can circulate over the system by getting high into these trophic levels, and then the loop is completed. The system allows this loop to be completed.
So, which is why Rachel Carson talked about, say, using a pesticide like DDT back in the 40s and 50s, when we as humans thought that we could target one species of, say, rice or hay or whatever it was, and that was fine. But that was thinking, oh, we just do this and it doesn't matter because it's not, we're just targeting this thing, as if it was not all connected. So when ultimately you get DDT passed from the hay to the hens or to the cows, and it ends up in the milk and therefore ends up in the baby and in the mother's breast milk or something like that.
Right. And so that's the reason why she preferred to call it a biocide instead of a pesticide, because in the word pesticide, you have a pest. Something that you consider as bad and you want to fight against. But she preferred to use biocide because, as you said, you cannot target the action of a chemical such as DDT. It will obviously circulate in the ecosystem. As I explained before, matter and energy circulates over the system, and the same happens with molecules like DDT. Sometimes they will even accumulate. So they will, little by little, will be accumulating and increasing their concentration in the trophic levels. So imagine you have zooplankton feeding on phytoplankton, and then you have fish feeding on zooplankton. So if you have some chemicals that are in the phytoplankton, you will find those same chemicals in the fish that ultimately humans will consume. So maybe you can have an impact, a much higher impact of those molecules in humans because they have been accumulating over the trophic system. And then when they come to the dish, when you eat the fish, you will get a lot more DDT or a much higher concentration of a particular chemical compared to what you initially put into the system to fight against the pest.
I'd like to take this little parenthesis to really illustrate as simply as possible what is happening with CO2 in the atmosphere for people to understand how that cycle works, and also why is plankton so important, and why is plankton so important in the oceans, and how that's related to oxygen. Because most people think that we need to protect the Amazon and we need to protect all these forests around the world. Yes, and the biggest producer of oxygen on the planet is the ocean. So can we talk a little bit about that, about those cycles?
Okay, CO2, it's carbon dioxide. So it's a natural byproduct of respiration. This is what we do to get energy from the food that we consume. So our cells contain the machinery that allows us to exploit that energy. And for this, we use a metabolism that we call respiration. So we inbreathe oxygen, and then by some chemical reactions, we produce CO2, carbon dioxide. So it's a natural molecule that you can find all over the world. Over the history of the planet, concentrations of CO2 have been varying a lot. In the past centuries, we have had much more CO2 than we have now. What happens in this particular time of human life is that we have been producing much more CO2 than before in the history of humanity. And this is because of the use of fuel, of fossil energies. So we are burning coal, we are using petrol-derived energies, and the combustion of those energies produce CO2. They will release CO2. And over the past few years, we have overpassed this, I would say, symbolic limit of 400 ppms, particular particles per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Compared to what has been the concentration of CO2 in the past, is not very dramatic, because the Earth has had higher concentration of CO2 before. The problem is that this concentration is increasing too fast. Over just 150 years, we have been moving from, let's say, 200 ppms to over 410 ppms. And this will have negative impacts on climate, because CO2, as you may know, is a gas that can help increasing the temperature of the Earth. It will act like as a barrier, not allowing the heat from the atmosphere to be released into the out of the atmosphere. So this heat will accumulate and will result in an increase in the temperature of the planet. So by producing more CO2, will increase the chances that the temperature will keep increasing over the next decades. We are at a point that we need to find solutions for that. We need to find a way so we can decrease the amount of CO2 that we produce. We need to think about the ways to eventually also capture more CO2. Because as you said, forests have the capacity to capture CO2. They do the opposite as we do. They do photosynthesis. And photosynthesis is, in a way, opposite to respiration, because instead of using oxygen and releasing CO2, they use CO2 and release oxygen. And for many decades, people say that tropical forest was the best way to reduce CO2 emissions by increasing the area of tropical forest. But indeed, it's oceans that are the main responsible for capturing the CO2 and decreasing the CO2 that is free in the atmosphere. And by oceans, I mean the photosynthetic organisms that live in the oceans mostly, and that is the algae that live in the oceans. Those are the ones responsible for fixing the majority of the CO2 that is present in the atmosphere.
But we can't think of that as a solution, can we? Because it's also an excess CO2 in the atmosphere going into the ocean. Isn't that the reason behind the acidification of the water?
Yeah, there's two problems indeed in there, because the higher the temperature of the planet, the lower the capacity of the oceans to use the CO2, to capture the CO2. But the more CO2 you capture, the less you will be able to the less CO2 you will be able to capture too, because the system gets saturated. There will be not enough, I would say, reactants, or the capacity of the system to capture the CO2 will be decreased because there's already too many CO2 dissolved in the water. And it's get worse if the temperatures keep increasing. So now that you mention it, there's one project, a big project about trying to fight against warming, which is reducing the pH increasing the pH of the oceans to be able to bring it back the capacity to capture more CO2. So you could fight against climate warming by increasing the capacity of the oceans to capture more CO2. So in that case, less CO2 will be available in the atmosphere, and so this warming effect will be reduced by forcing the oceans to capture more CO2.
And are there any side effects for corals and marine ecosystems in doing that?
Yes, apparently there would be. So another side effect of climate change and temperature increase is that the corals are decreasing. So the area covered by corals is decreasing because by increasing the temperature and by increasing the CO2 dissolving water, those organisms that form corals are less able to synthesize their exoskeleton, the structure that gives them the form. And apparently, if the temperatures keep increasing over the next decades, it's possible that all the coral reefs that we know today will disappear because of this lost capacity to produce the system that gives them the structure. Yeah.
So guys, I'm usually talking in the podcast about understanding our relationship to the environment and understanding how systems work on the planet in this circular or cyclical way. Because most of our pains and suffering and the place we're in is because we have sort of forced our industry and our, in a linear way, and the way we transform the environment and we engineer our systems of living has been very disconnected from the fact that everything is connected. We're on the planet, and the chemical composition of the planet is fixed, and it's not like we get new elements all the time. So it was very interesting the other day when I was talking with you, Patrick, because you were talking about changes in an ecosystem and how when things change to a certain degree, it's not like you can just go back to the state the system was in before, because the way the system is structured has completely changed. So it's concerning. It's concerning, and I think I've asked you this question before, but have we done that to the whole on a planetary scale, or is it certain ecosystems around the planet that we have changed drastically and we can't just simply go back to the state they were in? Or are we just facing a huge catastrophe, or what's up?
Well, there's a theory in ecology that is called the theory of alternative stable states, which means that ecosystems or ecological systems do not behave linearly. By this, I mean that imagine you increase the temperature of an ecosystem and you suddenly discover that there's been a change in the ecosystem. By change, I mean the dominant species will shift from one to the other. And this is a major change in an ecological system. You have a system that's been dominated by phytoplankton, and suddenly, because of an increase in the amount of phosphorus that you have in the system, it will shift into a system dominated by cyanobacteria, for instance. And the theory of alternative stable states suggests that systems do not behave linearly, that after a certain threshold, the system will just basculate into another stable system. And it's not just a matter of returning back to the original conditions to bring the system back to the other alternative stable state. The system will require another huge change to be able to get back to the original system. And this is problematic for us ecologists, because if ecosystems do not behave linearly, we will have much more trouble in predicting how the system will react to a particular perturbations made by humans. So imagine we keep increasing the temperature of the planet. We will not be able to know how we can change the things back to the original way they were functioning before. It's not just a matter of decreasing the temperature and everything's going to be fine. And you can think about the same thing by increasing nitrogen or phosphorus levels in lakes. They will suddenly basculate into another alternative stable state, and it's not just by decreasing the amount of phosphorus or nitrogen that you will get back to the original system. So it's very problematic when to know that some systems are functioning that way. They are not linear, but instead they are like chaotic, or predicting them, it's much more difficult than it used to be.
So you couldn't even say that they're not even circular or cyclical necessarily, because they're much more complex than that. At the beginning of our conversation, you were saying that evolution has worked by creating this vast amount of biodiversity on the planet for survival. We have created systems of food production and systems of usage of resources that are sort of diminishing biodiversity, that are working against biodiversity, say monocrops or feedlots or overuse of fossil fuels and so on. What is the consequence of that for ecosystems? Like if you have, say, a country where there's vast amounts of monocrops like corn and rice and wheat and all that, what is happening to ecosystems with that? And where I also wanted to address the fact that all those nutrients coming from all those monocrops and how they run into the rivers and end up in the ocean, what is happening with that loop?
Okay, I'm glad that you mentioned this, because we have been talking so far a lot about climate change and maybe not enough about biodiversity, which is the main topic of my research. So we humans have been destroying biodiversity for over thousands of years. We have been destroying entire ecosystems. We have been overexploiting other systems. We have been contaminating ecosystems. And in the end, all this has been negative for biodiversity. We have been decreasing biodiversity. And I remember what I mentioned before. Diversity is not just about decreasing the number of species. It's also about decreasing the genetic pool of the species of entire ecosystems. It's about decreasing the number of forms that you can have in a particular ecosystems. And when you decrease diversity, the first negative impact that you can have by decreasing diversity is by reducing the capacity of the ecosystems to cope with change. If you want to be able to keep producing enough levels of food, if you want to keep producing enough levels of wood, for instance, it has been shown that you need a diversity of living forms. Monocultures can be very good for producing one particular type of food. Of course, if your interest is on producing corn, it would be better for you to only have corn in your field. But when you think about the entire ecosystem, you need to think that you will need other benefits from nature. You also need pollinations, for instance. You need pollinators that will be able to help you reproducing those crops. And if you reduce all the systems to just the more productive ones, you will be losing the capacity of the ecosystem to react to changes and to produce other functions that are not only producing biomass. Because the production of biomass or the production of food is just one benefit that humans get from natural systems, okay? But there's many others. The capacity of plants to capture CO2, for instance. This is another benefit that humans get from nature for free. By reducing the diversity of plants, you reduce the capacity of forest and of crops to capture the CO2. The same can be said when preventing flooding. It's been shown that the higher the diversity of plants that you have in a particular field, the lower the risk of having a flooding, because a variety of plants will be able to use in a better way the water that is available. The soil will be in better shape, so the water that is running through this field will be better used by the plants. So this will reduce the risk of flooding. So of course, when you think about only food production, monocultures can be the solution. They are much better than a diverse polyculture. But when you think about other functions, it's basically much better to have a diversity of plants instead of just having one, to be able to provide many other benefits. And this is what we call in the ecological theory ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are those goods and benefits that humans get from nature for free. And over the past few years, there's been an effort in putting numbers, in putting a price to those, a value, a market value, into those benefits that humans get from nature, in order to get a real impact into the policymakers and the stakeholders that will eventually decide which species to protect or which ecosystem to protect. If you give them some kind of an economic value to nature, they will be more prone to say, okay, this is important to be saved. We have to save this because this can save a lot of money, or this can be a huge amount of money that we will have to get into to be able to restore an ecosystem or to restore the provisioning of a service by a particular ecological system.
You could say that a monoculture is more efficient. It is. But in the long run, it isn't, because it's just destroying ecosystems and missing out on all these ecosystem services, all these things that nature gives us for free that we take for granted. And we are at a time where we need other forms of agriculture to capture more carbon from the atmosphere, for example. The soil gets richer, it doesn't get as depleted, and you prevent floods, like you were saying. But also you could also lessen the use of or get rid of completely of the use of pesticides that end up in the water, that ends up in the river, that ends up in the ocean. I'd like to talk about nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen and all that, and maybe tied to the seaweed crisis around the world. But just for our listeners to understand why we talk so much about phosphorus and nitrogen and what they are and why are they such important nutrients and part of those huge natural cycles.
All living forms need elements, like chemical elements, to build their matter and to capture energy. So the energy and the matter that circulates over ecosystems, they are stocked into molecules, okay? And to be able to build, for instance, amino acids, and to be able to build up molecules that produce energy, we need elements such as nitrogen and phosphorus. So this is why they are so important, because the amino acids that will build up into proteins are made of nitrogen. The molecules that we use to transport energy in our bodies are made of phosphorus. So that's why we need to use nitrogen and phosphorus. And it's the same for any organisms that you think of. Bacteria, fungi, birds, they all need those elements to be able to get energy to survive, to live, and to reproduce and to produce biomass. So you need many things, but among those many things that you need, perhaps nitrogen and phosphorus are among the most important ones. And so that's why we have been talking a lot about those two elements, because they are essential for any kind of living forms. In many cases, nitrogen and phosphorus are what we call the limiting factors in many ecosystems. By limiting factors, I mean that those elements are the one controlling the growth of a species or the growth of a population of one particular life form. And this can be shown by adding that element into the system and looking if by adding that element you will get an extra growth in the species. And this happens very often. You add some nitrogen or some phosphorus into a crop, and the crop will produce more biomass because that element was limiting. The plants were not able to capture enough nitrogen or enough phosphorus, and when you give them, and that's the basis of fertilization, you give them more nitrogen, you give them more phosphorus so they can produce more biomass. And this is a very good transition to talk about those cycles, those chemical cycles that we humans have been disrupting for many decades. So as I said before, we have been using fertilizers to increase the productivity of crops in order to be able to provide enough food for everyone, to make those systems more productive, to be able to feed everyone on Earth. the human population has been increasing for over 200 years exponentially. We thought at some point that the maximum capacity of the planet will be reached soon, but the latest numbers have been shown that we're still increasing exponentially, and we don't know when that's going to stop. At the same time, we are having, in general, a way of consuming that is not sustainable. We are too many in this planet, and we have been consuming the wrong way. We have not been sustainable in the way we get those goods and those materials that we need to fulfill our needs. So for that, one of the solutions has been to increase the productivity of the systems, as I mentioned before, using fertilizers. So that's good because you will have more productive crops. But at the same time, you will have a surplus of nitrogen and phosphorus that will be running free into the system. And sometimes this can have negative impacts. When you put a fertilizer into a field, the extra amount of nitrogen and phosphorus that is not being used by the plants will finish in the aquifers below water. It will run into the river and finally will get into the ocean. And sometimes you can have negative impacts, as you mentioned, for instance, for the seagrass weed in the Caribbean Sea. Apparently, this surplus of nitrogen as phosphorus coming from the Amazon basin is getting into the Atlantic Ocean, and this extra amount of nitrogen and phosphorus has been used by this seagrass to be able to reproduce in such a high number and to be able to colonize places in the world that normally are not being colonized by that species, just because the conditions that they require to grow are now present in those regions in the world. The Sargassum Sea, it's been there for a long time, and there you can find huge patches of sargassum floating in the ocean. But over the last few years, those huge amounts of sargassum have been moving west into the Caribbean, and you can find a lot of issues related to the sargassum right now in many islands in the Caribbean. And that's apparently because of this surplus of nitrogen and phosphorus coming from the Amazon basin. So you can imagine that something that happens in the Amazon basin can have an impact in the ocean, in the Caribbean. So imagine how human activities can change the entire way the planet works.
Yeah, that's scary. Could you illustrate a little more how it works? Like, say you have all these nitrogen and phosphorus coming in, so the algae take over. But because they take over, how does that change the ecosystem?
I would say apparently, because again, this is research under exploration right now. So the more nitrogen you get, the more phosphorus you get, the better the conditions for the sargassum. So they like it. They like when there is more phosphorus. They like it when there's more nitrogen. And what's going to happen is that they will produce more biomass. They will be more abundant. And the sargassum will cover the surface of the ocean. Initially, this is beneficial for many species of fish or many species of other living forms living in the ocean. They like this kind of environment because it's a protection for them. So it's a nursery for many fish. So that's good initially. But when you have too many sargassum, this will block the entrance of the sunlight into the ocean. So all the organisms living behind this layer of sargassum will be depleted in sunlight. They will not receive enough sunlight. So that's one potential negative impact of sargassum. The other impact is more a health issue. When you have these huge amounts of sargassum getting to the coast in the Caribbean, this surplus of sargassum will start to decompose. And this produces some fumes that are toxic for humans. So it becomes very difficult to breathe when you have this decomposition of sargassum. So people with health issues will have a lot of trouble into breathing near to these beaches that are covered in sargassum, decomposing material, because you have a lot of material that is not supposed to be there, and local authorities, they don't know very well how to deal with it. Do they bury it? Do they burn it? Do they move just inland to see what happens and how they decompose? So the problem is that all the system is possibly getting into another stable state, which is dominated by the sargassum. So perhaps we are in front of one example of a system that is shifting into another alternative stable state, which is dominated by the sargassum. But we still need to wait to see if this is true or not. We're just in the middle of the transition, if this transition is happening, and we'll need to see what's going to happen.
Should we talk a little bit about your work with lakes and how it relates to all of this?
So yeah, what I do, as you mentioned in the introduction, mostly is based on laboratory studies. So why do I do that? I do this because it's the only way you can get into the detailed mechanistic explanation of how ecosystems work. In one extreme of the gradient of research that you can do as an ecologist, you can do field work. You can go into the wild and see how things work. This is nice because this is nature. This is how things really work. The downside of doing this kind of work is that you cannot get into a very detailed explanation of how species are interacting to each other or how the ecosystem is influencing the species or how species are influencing the ecosystem. So the benefit of doing field work is that you have natural conditions, real nature. The downside is that you don't have a mechanistic explanation. You cannot get into the details of how everything is working. In the other extreme of the gradient of research that you can do is laboratory research. You will control everything. You can control the temperature of the chamber where you're growing your algae. You can control the amount of nitrogen you give into them. You can control the amount of CO2 that you are providing them. So you control everything. In this scenario, you have all the benefits of a control system. You can determine causality from factor A to factor B. You can tell, for instance, if increasing the temperature in the system will result in an increase in biomass production. This is something that you can test in the laboratory conditions because you can manipulate temperature by keeping all the other parameters fixed. The downside is that this is far from reality. This is not real. In real life, you have many species interacting at the same time. You have different trophic levels influencing each other at the same time. So that's why I think complementing the two perspectives is a good way to understand much better how ecosystems work. You can mix laboratory studies with field studies. So why do I use phytoplankton? Because, as I said before, they are the basis of the trophic web in aquatic ecosystems. They are the ones getting the energy from the sun and make it available to the other organisms in the system. And apart from that, because they are responsible for fixing CO2. So they have this double role, which is fixing CO2 and at the same time providing energy and matter for the other members of the ecosystem. So my research is about manipulating the conditions in the laboratory. For instance, diversity. I can, by manipulating the composition of my cultures, I can generate a gradient on diversity. I can say, let's put 2 species together, let's put 10 species together, let's put 20 species together. And after a few days, after a few months, measure how the system works depending on the number of species that you have in your system. You can compare having 2 species to having 10 species to having 20 species. You can compare, for instance, the amount of biomass they produce. You can compare, for instance, the amount of nitrogen that they use for this time period. And you can say if, for instance, diversity is good for nitrogen use, or if it's good for phosphorus use. You can really tackle down if the more diversity you have, the better the system will be functioning. And eventually, the more benefits humans can get from the systems because they function better, they provide more benefits, they provide more goods, such as fixation of CO2. So I do manipulations in very simple ecosystems to be able to tackle down the mechanisms that are behind. But at the same time, I do research in the field, especially in Ecuador, where I have been sampling some lakes in high altitude, over 3,200 meters above sea level. For the first time, we have been collecting samples there, water samples there, to determine which species of phytoplankton are present there, how the system works, and how the diversity of those phytoplankton determines how the system works. Because by collecting data from different lakes, we can generate a gradient, again, of diversity and see if those lakes that have more species of phytoplankton produce more biomass or are capable of dealing with higher concentrations of nitrogen or phosphorus, and if they're capable of using more of those resources and transform it into biomass that will be available for other organisms.
You've talked about three main issues. We have the loss of biodiversity, we have climate change, global warming, and we have the human impact on the environment and natural systems, that we change the environment so much that it probably goes into a different state altogether. Where are we at? What can we do about it? We're too many and we're consuming too much. What can someone who's not a scientist like me or someone listening to this episode do? They've gotten a glimpse of how ecosystems work and how life operates in very complex ways. What can we do? What do you think?
Well, as I mentioned before, if we want to summarize the two big issues that we are confronting right now as humans, those two issues are we are too many and we are consuming the wrong way. So I don't think the first problem will be solved easily. I don't think that we can do much right now to solve the problem of reducing human population. This will happen at some point. Every ecological system has a limit. We will not be increasing our population unlimited in the future. At some point, we're going to stop increasing our population. But I think that the most immediate solution can come from changing our way of consuming things. The way that we produce energy. The way that we impact the ecosystems. So by this I mean we can change in a day-by-day basis. We can all do an effort and to be able to consume in a more sustainable way. We can, for instance, decide to consume locally. We can decide that we reduce the amount of red meat that we consume. For instance, those are good examples. We can also decide that we are going to be more careful about the waste that we produce. We can decide to consume more products that are less with less plastic on them, that are more that are produced in a more sustainable way. We can change the way that we move around. We can give more importance to public transportation instead of just using our cars. We can the short commutes, we can do them by bike instead of using a car. So those basic but very important details that we can change in our day-by-day basis, and that we have, because we are too many, those small changes can have a huge impact.
Yeah, I agree. There's, just like you were saying, that we take for granted ecosystem services, like the cool stuff that nature gives us for free, like capturing carbon and all those things. Which, by the way, would be cool to do a little reminder of what those are. Because it's cool to remember what we take for granted, because that's why we call it taking it for granted. And so on a daily basis, there's also so many things that we take for granted. And I love to look at familiar things in unfamiliar ways. So like rethink, why is it that I buy this thing, or because that's the way you and me as consumers, we can, because we're not policymakers, because we're not running a multinational, oil company. how can we shape the world? We shape it with our purchases, because we're like doing it all the time, and there's millions of us buying every day a lot of stuff. So what we choose to buy ultimately, shapes or steers the market in the right direction anyway, which is why we're seeing around the planet so much more organic and bio products. In Europe, it's called bio, not organic, but just those small practical things you can choose to do and not to do. Is there anything else that we haven't addressed that you'd like to talk about, Patrick?
Yeah, maybe a little bit more about the ecosystem services idea. So I would like to say that this definition of ecosystem services comes from the Millennium Assessment, which was a big report written over a decade ago by experts in the field about how humans benefit from nature. And in parallel to the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, there's another, I would say, instance that is more focused on biodiversity, which is IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So this platform will release a new report next year about the situation of diversity in our planet and how humans have been impacting the biodiversity and what are the consequences of that. And one of the things that seems to be happening is that there's a call for stopping calling those benefits ecosystem services, because this is a anthropocentric view of nature. This is considering that nature is there for providing things for humans, and that is not true. So we as a different species, we are benefiting from nature in a different way as compared to other species. We are overexploiting many ecosystems, and we are producing more waste than any other species. So our impact, as we mentioned before, is much higher than the impact of any other species, because we are too many and because we are doing it the wrong way. So one of the calls that they will be doing is that we should stop calling these ecosystem services, but instead of that, we should be telling about the benefits that we get from nature. So stop calling them ecosystem services. Nature is not providing any services. We are benefiting from nature. So we should call them the benefits that we get from nature. And as one example, a very good one that I can give you is pollination. So this is a benefit that we get from nature that we take for granted. So pollination is this benefit that birds, that insects, that even some species of bats provide to humans by moving pollen from one plant to the other. And in the end, this will produce fruits. So those plants that require pollination in order to produce fruit that will be used by humans as a food resource, these are made by organisms mostly. And this has been done since the appearance of flowering plants, and we take it for granted. But if we keep decreasing the diversity of pollinators in our planet, for instance, with honeybees, if we keep reducing the amount of honeybees that are in the planet, and we keep decreasing the diversity of these pollinators, we will be putting at risk this benefit that we take for granted, the benefit of pollination. And somebody has to do it. And if we don't have pollinators that do it, we humans will have to do it. We will have to pollinate our own crops. And this has been evaluated as a huge amount of money that should be put into covering those pollinations that will not be able to be made by the insects, but instead should be made by humans. And this is something that we take for granted.
And that's fascinating. What does science say about those honeybees? Because there's a lot of theories, and you see a lot of stuff online about glyphosate being one of the causes behind honeys dying. And do you have any data on that?
Well, I don't have the data, but I have read some papers on it. And the decline in the abundance, this is the number of pollinators, but also the diversity of pollinators has been decreasing over the past decades. And that is a fact. You have the numbers out there in the papers showing that indeed there's much less, a much reduced diversity of pollinators and a much reduced number of pollinators as before. Honeybees is just one example of the pollinators. They are responsible for the majority of pollination, but at the same time, you have beetles that do pollination. You have flies that do pollination. You have butterflies that do pollination. And as I said before, there's also birds doing pollination. There's bats. And in some extreme cases, there's also mammals. Like bats are mammals, but there are other kind of rodent-like mammals that do pollination. So pollination is not only about honeybees. But this is one example of one particular organism, honeybees, that have been impacted negatively by human activities. As you said, for instance, by using glyphosate. So this has apparently a huge impact on honeybees. They lose their capacity to fly and to know where they are. Some other studies show that, yes, like they have a reduced reproduction rate. Like honeybees get reproduce less well after being in contact with some substances present in the glyphosate. We are also destroying the habitats for those insects to reproduce. If you replace a forest by just a monoculture, those insects will have no place where to reproduce. They will not be able to build their nest because there's only one species there and they are not used to build their nest in that species. So that's something that can be solved by, for instance, keeping a little bit of native forest next to the crops so the insects still find a way to reproduce, a place where to reproduce. And even in urban ecosystems, now there's some solutions that have been implemented, like building insect hotels, little structures with pieces of wood and pieces of different materials, so the bees and other insects can get into those hotels and they can reproduce there and live there, protected from the environment. And in Geneva, for instance, we have there is a few projects about putting honey haze in the top of the buildings, so the bees can still find a place where to reproduce in urban ecosystem in the city. Because even if you don't think so, there's a lot of diversity of plants in the city and they still need insects to reproduce. So think about the reproduction of plants is not about producing food for humans. They need to reproduce just for them. And we benefit from that. So initially we need to think about the basic of it. The initial reason why pollination happens is because plants need those pollinators to reproduce. Fruits are just the reproductive structure of a plant that turned to be a good way to provide food to humans and other species. But in the end, it's something that the plant produces for itself.
That's awesome. I love to ask people when I give workshops or something like that what a fruit is if they were to define it in terms of body parts. And most people aren't really aware that, it's an ovary with the seeds, It's just that it's kind of inside out. Nature's weird. Where can people who want to learn more go? Where can they find out more about the stuff you're talking about or your research, if anything? Although your work is very specialized for scientific publications and all that. Or are any books that you would recommend people to read or people to research?
Yeah, I will recommend the books that I recommend to my students. So I do teach, and this is something we forgot to mention a little bit. So I do teach at different levels at the University of Geneva. I do teach, for instance, evolution of life for geology students. So this is a challenging task, but I really like it, which is teaching people with no background in biology how evolution works. So how life emerged in our planet and how little by little this life transformed and gave origin to all the living forms that we see today. I also teach ecology for third-year biology students. So, and this is one recommendation I can do to all the people listening to us today. I can recommend some books on basic ecology. So you can have Essentials of Ecology by Begon et al. This is a very nice book, which is no more than $40. You can get it for very cheap, and you can get a very good introduction into ecology and to environmental sciences with some evolution on it, with some conservation biology too into that book. So you can get an idea of how we can help protecting diversity. I also do teach some lessons into masters, in a master that we have at the University of Geneva, which is called the Master in Environmental Sciences. And in this master, we have people from a large variety of backgrounds. We have people coming from, of course, scientific backgrounds. We have biologists, but we also have a physicist. We also have people interested in climate. We have people interested in economy, in health. So a huge variety of people coming into this master. And whenever they ask me what kind of readings they can have, I always tell them, start by looking at those Essentials of Ecology books that will give you a glimpse of all the things that we have been discussing today, how the matter and the energy circulates over ecological systems, how you can measure diversity, how you can quantify productivity in an ecosystem, and all the things that we mentioned today.
Very cool. Very cool. So many things to think about and read. Yeah. There's a very interesting question, and it's like having put ourselves in charge of our own evolution and that of other species, what will we choose to do with this extraordinary power? It's a good question. Good question to ask. We have tremendous power, and it's our responsibility. We have the responsibility today to be informed and choose how we consume that energy, and how we choose to live. Patrick, thank you so much. This was awesome. Very interesting. Wish you the best, and I'll talk to you hopefully soon, some other time.
It's been a pleasure, Thomas. Thank you very much. Really nice talking to you and explaining all these topics to your audience, and I'm happy to be able to contact you again in the future and to be able to talk a little bit more with you. Thank you.